I had just pulled the needle from my left arm veins thinning after 3 months of chemo when the meeting request appeared. No subject line, no context. Just 10:0 am, 12th floor conference room. No message, no courtesy. Just silence, the kind that hums like a locked steel door behind you. And I knew. After nearly 2 decades at Halverton Company, you learn to sense the cold before the storm breaks. They called it a realignment meeting. But when you're fighting stage 2 cancer, waking each morning with aching bones and patches of hair missing, you understand that realignment is just a sanitized word for replacement by someone younger, healthier, and cheaper. I walked into the lobby with a silk scarf tied over the baldness that hadn't yet grown back. I still had 30 minutes before the meeting, so I sat in a small cafe downstairs, sipping peppermint tea out of habit, though it did nothing to calm the tightness spreading across my chest. I watched the faces pass young, old, familiar, indifferent. Colleagues I'd celebrated 15-year milestones with now moved past me like I was part of the furniture. 18 years. I wasn't a cog in the machine, I was the thread that held together our fragile relationships in East Asia. Where one misstep in etiquette could cost tens of millions, I'd held it all with a careful, invisible hand. But that didn't matter anymore. Not when the new leadership believed legacy meant liability. When I stood up and straightened my collar, walking toward the elevator that would carry me to floor 12, I knew exactly what I'd find. To them, I was just another line item flowing in the wrong direction. But what they didn't know was this. People who survive chemo, pain, and silent injustice, they learn to rise, even when no one believes they can. The hallway leading to the 12th floor was unusually quiet, the kind of silence that isn't peaceful but anticipates impact. As I stepped out of the elevator, the fluorescent lights hummed above me with a sterile indifference, and every footstep I took echoed against the polished floor like a warning shot I couldn't ignore. The door to the conference room was already ajar, and seated inside, with a manila folder perfectly centered in front of him, was Caleb Yatest, the new CEO of Hensley Rowe. He was young, crisp, in a suit that hadn't known a wrinkle, and carried the kind of confidence only the untested could afford. To his left sat Elaine from HR, a woman I'd shared elevators and awkward small talk with for years, now looking anywhere but at me. Her fingers clutched a pen too tightly, knuckles pale, face locked in a fragile neutrality that told me everything before a single word was spoken. There were no greetings, no time wasted on pleasantries. Caleb gestured to the chair across from him and began to speak with the composed rhythm of someone who had rehearsed this moment, not out of guilt or nervousness, but with the detachment of someone checking an item off a list. We've been evaluating internal efficiencies across all departments, he began, each word measured and mechanical. After careful review, we've decided to consolidate several roles, including yours. I sat still, listening as he continued, outlining how a third-party firm overseas would be handling future communications, and how the company needed to be leaner and more agile. None of the buzzwords mattered. What mattered was that after 18 years of quietly holding up a critical, fragile system of trust between this company and its foreign partners after, giving everything I had, even while undergoing chemotherapy, just weeks before I was now being thanked and erased in the same breath. I didn't speak. I didn't ask questions. I had lived through too many transitions to mistake this for anything but what it was, a carefully staged betrayal. Caleb leaned back in his chair as if the worst had passed, mistaking my silence for resignation. Then, with a faint, almost condescending smile, he added, "Of course, we appreciate your long service, and we've arranged a severance package that's more than fair." Elaine slid the envelope across the table as though it might burn her fingertips, and I saw something flicker in her expression. Guilt, maybe, but she didn't meet my eyes. Around me, the room remained still, sterile, and suffocating. I looked from her to Caleb, who now avoided my gaze altogether, and I realized, with a weight that settled deep in my chest, that not a single person in that building would raise their voice for me. Not one. It wasn't just the dismissal that cued it was the silence, the deliberate absence of protest. The way colleagues I had mentored, fought for, covered for during tough deadlines, now kept their heads down, pretending not to notice what was happening to me. Some looked away out of fear, others out of convenience. Either way, it was abandonment wrapped in corporate politeness. When I finally stood, I left the envelope untouched. Caleb's eyes lifted briefly, as if unsure whether to offer a handshake or let me leave unacknowledged. I didn't give him the choice. I walked out with my shoulders square, not because I felt strong, but because dignity was the only thing they hadn't tried to package and replace. As I moved down the corridor I had walked for nearly 2 decades, the walls seemed suddenly unfamiliar, colder. I passed by team photos we once took during better years, by desks that still carried the echoes of conversations long past. I passed Linda at reception, the same Linda who once cried when her mother passed and whom I'd comforted through an entire lunch hour. Now she offered only a tight-lipped nod, her fingers frozen over the keyboard. Outside, the morning had turned gray. The clouds were heavy, low over the skyline of Milwaukee, and the wind carried the unmistakable scent of rain. I didn't rush, I didn't cry, I didn't tremble. I made it to my car, slid into the driver's seat, and sat quietly as the first drops began to blur the windshield. The city faded into watery streaks while I stared straight ahead, hands on the wheel, my breath steady. What hurt most wasn't the job I'd lost. It was the truth I couldn't unsee the years I had spent pouring myself into a company that now couldn't spare a full sentence to acknowledge my worth. They saw my age, my illness, and assumed I had no more to offer. But they were wrong. And though I didn't know how yet, I understood something with absolute clarity as the rain gathered momentum. They would feel the absence of everything I once gave them far more than they ever appreciated it while I was still there. The weekend after my dismissal was quieter than I expected, not in the sense of peace, but in that peculiar stillness you feel just after a storm has passed, but before the ground has finished absorbing the water. I didn't cry, didn't run, didn't scramble to update my resume or beg for favors. I simply moved through my home with the same steady pace I had relied on during chemo, when strength came in ration doses, and even folding laundry felt like a small victory. I cleaned out the drawer where I used to keep office documents and business cards, carefully placing each file into a storage box, not because I needed to, but because ritual has its own kind of medicine. There were a few messages from former colleagues, those brave or kind enough to acknowledge what had happened. Most simply sent short texts, some of them vague, others laced with passive regret. "I'm so sorry. I didn't see it coming." Or, "You didn't deserve that." I responded politely, knowing many had stayed silent not out of malice but out of fear. Fear of being next. Fear of guilt by association. I didn't judge them. In corporate ecosystems like Hensley Row, survival often depended not on courage, but on invisibility. That Sunday evening, as rain tapped gently against a kitchen window, I powered up my old laptop, not to search for jobs, but to remind myself of something deeper me value. I scrolled through archived emails, decades of correspondence, notes from executives at partner companies across Asia, messages thanking me for my cultural insight, for salvaging deals that would have fallen through had someone else been in my place. These weren't compliments, they were acknowledgments, hard evidence of worth that couldn't be erased by a single folder in a conference room. Then, as if summoned by memory itself, my inbox pinged. It was a message from Jonathan Lee, a contact I had met 7 years ago at a finance forum in Seattle. He now headed international partnerships at a firm called Porter Nash Global Strategies, based in Chicago. The subject line was short: "Heard what happened, let's talk." My heart didn't race. I didn't leap out of my chair. I simply sat still for a moment, allowing the warmth of possibility to settle in without disturbing it. The next morning, while Milwaukee stirred under gray skies, I dressed deliberately, no longer in the subdued corporate grays I had worn at Hensley Row, but in a navy blouse I hadn't touched since before the diagnosis. It felt like armor, like reclamation. I packed a slim portfolio, nothing flashy, just a few samples of cross-cultural negotiation briefs and one letter of recommendation that still made me smile. I didn't need to oversell. The work spoke for itself. Porter Nash's offices were modern, but without the sterile edge that often comes with trying too hard. Jonathan met me in the lobby himself. Warm handshake, steady eye contact, no awkward glances toward my scarf, no quick reassessments once he saw I wasn't 25 and climbing. He led me into a modest conference room with soft lighting and chairs that didn't make you feel temporary. The conversation flowed naturally, not like an interview, but like a recognition of values, of shared standards, of experience that can't be mimicked with a crash course in global etiquette. Jonathan asked sharp questions, not about how many languages I spoke, but about how I'd handled delicate power dynamics with clients who smiled through silence and delivered decisions with ritual precision. I answered calmly, drawing not from theory, but from lived memory. And as I spoke, I saw something shift behind his eyes, not surprise, not skepticism, but relief. Relief that someone like me still existed in a world so eager to replace wisdom with noise. By the time I returned home that afternoon, there was already an offer in my inbox. It was generous, better salary, more autonomy, flexible health accommodations, and yet what mattered most was something they never wrote in bold: respect. They didn't just want me to translate culture. They wanted me to shape strategy. I accepted without hesitation. Meanwhile, I started hearing things quiet ripples from across town. At Hensley Row, the atmosphere was reportedly tense. The new agency they'd hired from Singapore was rotating account managers every few weeks, and important communications had begun slipping through the cracks. Word had it that Caleb was calling the absence of a dedicated liaison a streamlined upgrade, though those closest to the ground knew it was anything but. A former colleague texted me late that Thursday. He told the board you were a bottleneck, that your relationships were slowing progress. He says it's all working better now. I didn't reply. There was no need. Let them say what they needed to feel better. I had no intention of correcting the story, because I knew quietly, patiently, and without lifting a finger that the truth has its own weight, and in time, it always returns to settle where it belongs. Revenge, if done properly, should never come loud or hurried. It should arrive like winter, frost-silent, creeping, and inevitable. I didn't need to lift a sword or raise my voice. All I had to do was step aside and let time expose what arrogance had tried to bury. And so I waited. Within 2 weeks of my departure from Hensley Row, the ripples began to disturb their glassy surface. It started with a missed follow-up from the new liaison agency, nothing catastrophic. Just a cultural misstep during a virtual call with executives from Mizuho Finance in Tokyo. The translation was technically correct, but tone is everything in diplomacy, and what had once been read as nuance now came across as rudeness. They recovered, barely, but the trust had frayed. The agency, efficient on paper, lacked one thing that couldn't be documented in bullet points: history. And in Asia, history is the foundation upon which every handshake stands. Meanwhile, I moved steadily within my new role at Porter Nash, not with the desperation of someone clinging to relevance, but with the ease of someone finally valued for what they'd quietly mastered. My office, smaller than my old one but filled with natural light and quiet respect, became a place of deliberate planning. I didn't seek to undermine Caleb or tarnish Hensley Row. I didn't need to. They were unraveling by their own hand. But when Jonathan asked me during a strategy meeting if I had any remaining ties to Golden Summit Holdings, the massive investment firm we had once worked closely with at my old job, I paused, took a slow breath, and said, "Yes, I do." That night, I called Mr. Hanthy, Chairman's chief advisor, and someone I had exchanged Lunar New Year greetings with for the past 11 years. I spoke not as a representative of my new firm, but as Margaret Lynn, the person who had once postponed her own medical leave to personally host a visiting delegation from Seoul, because trust cannot be outsourced. I apologized for the sudden disruption in our relationship, and clarified in gentle but truthful terms that I was no longer involved in any capacity at Hensley Row. Mr. Han was quiet for a moment, then said, almost offhandedly, "That explains the change in tone." The call ended with a promise to reconnect properly. This time. By the end of that week, 2 of Hensley Blank Row's key clients had quietly begun exploring alternatives. No press releases, no sudden terminations, just meetings that were postponed indefinitely, follow-ups that never came, and questions that no one in their shiny new leadership team could answer without Googling etiquette guides they barely understood. Word drifted through the industry like smoke-loathing official, but everyone could smell the fire coming. It was during a rainy Thursday afternoon, as I reviewed regional engagement metrics with a junior analyst, that my phone rang with a number I hadn't seen in months. It was a former colleague from Hensley, Melissa, the only one who had sent me a handwritten note after I was let go. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. "He's asking about you," she said softly. "Caleb, he's trying to figure out if there's a way to bring you back in, unofficially. He's even mentioned a consultancy agreement." I thanked her, hung up, and sat quietly with the thought. I wasn't surprised. The pattern was predictable. They break what they don't understand, then panic when it no longer functions. Still, I didn't rush to answer. I let them sweat. When the official email finally came through the next morning, clumsily worded, pretending to offer a unique opportunity for collaboration, I waited another day before responding with a short reply. We can talk. On my terms. Caleb arrived at my new office late, dressed in a tailored navy suit that hung looser than it used to, the stress finally catching up to his posture. He tried to smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. I offered him a seat, then let him speak. He fumbled through explanations about transition challenges, external miscommunications, evolving needs. He never said the word mistake. That would have required humility. When he finally stopped, I let the silence stretch just long enough to unsettle him. You're offering me a role, I said, folding my hands, but without authority, without credit, and without correcting the narrative you spread after you let me go. You want the benefit of my work without the responsibility of acknowledging your error. He shifted uncomfortably, eyes flicking to the door as if calculating whether this had all been a mistake. It's not personal, Margaret, it's business. I smiled, but only slightly. So was my answer. I agreed, eventually, to consult under a temporary contract that granted me access but no title, no public recognition. Caleb thought he was being clever, reclaiming a piece of what he had lost without surrendering pride. But what he didn't know was that I had no intention of salvaging his reputation. I was there to ensure the final break happened under my terms, not his. I re-entered the building I had once called home, now as an outsider wearing the badge of a temporary visitor. I made no speeches. I offered no smiles. I walked past the new hires, those who had once mocked my old school ways, now scrambling to keep up with clients who had stopped returning calls. And then, quietly, methodically, I began to pull the last threads loose. By the time I requested the final meeting with Caleb, I already knew how it would end, not with yelling or slammed doors, but with the kind of silence that speaks louder than any reprimand ever could. It was a gray Monday morning, the sky over Milwaukee thick with low clouds, and the streets below our glass tower buzzed with early commuters clinging to routine like lifeline. I arrived 10 minutes early, not out of anxiety, but out of habit. I had always believed in showing up prepared, even when walking into a room you know you'll never return to. Caleb entered a few moments later, his smile brittle, his steps slower, as if the weight of a crumbling company had finally begun to press against the polished exterior he had worn so confidently months before. He sat down, adjusted the cuffs of his dress shirt, and offered the practiced grin of a man desperate to salvage something without admitting it was already lost. I'm glad you wanted to meet, he began, his voice deliberately light. We're in a bit of a rough patch, but I think with your insight, we can still turn this around. Maybe even find a long-term role for you here again if that's something you'd consider. I watched him carefully, not with anger or triumph, but with the calm certainty that comes when you've already made peace with walking away. He was still clinging to the illusion of control, still hoping that by dangling an offer, he could buy back everything he had broken without ever acknowledging he had been the one who broke it. I'm not here to advise you, I said quietly, folding my hands in front of me. I'm here to end this properly. His expression faltered, just for a second, but it was enough. A flicker of panic, quickly masked by confusion. I warned you, I continued, that relationships take time, that trust doesn't transfer through contracts or slide decks. You fired me without understanding what I did. You replaced me with a contractor you didn't vet. You told people I was unnecessary, a relic of the past, someone too old, too sick to keep up. He opened his mouth, perhaps to deny it, perhaps to defend himself, but I didn't give him the room. I am the reason Golden Summit walked away, I said, my tone even, my gaze steady. I am the reason the South Korea deal collapsed, and why Porter, Nash, now holds the accounts you once called cornerstones. You lost everything not because I sabotaged you, but because you built your house on a foundation you didn't care to understand. The color drained slowly from his face, as the truth settled in deeper than any report or email ever could. I stood, smoothing the lines of my blazer, not out of vanity, but as punctuation of final act of dignity. You thought you were streamlining, I said, voice low and calm, but what you did was amputate the only limb that could have saved you from drowning. Caleb stared at me, speechless, finally seeing not just the damage, but the source and understanding, far too late, that it hadn't been accidental. I didn't come back to be rescued, I added, pausing at the door. I came back so you would know who dismantled the empire you built on arrogance. And with that, I left no handshake, no farewell, not even a glance back at the man who had once believed I was replaceable. The office, now a shell of what it once was, stood behind me like a husk abandoned by its own soul. The elevator doors closed with a soft hiss, and I exhaled, steady, whole, and untouchable. Outside, the rain had stopped, though the pavement still shimmered with the memory of it. I walked slowly toward my car, not because I was unsure, but because there is something sacred in knowing you ended a chapter with your spine straight and your heart intact. They thought I was done. They thought age, illness, and silence meant weakness. But all they did was give me time to plan, to prepare, and to prove, once and for all, that people like me don't disappear. We endure. We adapt. And when the time is right, we rise. If this story stirred something in you, if you've ever been overlooked, replaced, or cast aside just when you had the most to give, know this: your value doesn't expire. Your experience isn't obsolete. And your quiet strength might just be the storm they never saw coming. Subscribe to the Underdog's Revenge for more stories where justice comes quietly but lands hard.